started. So yeah, good. Nigel, great to have you with us. Thanks for coming back. Always good to have you online with us. And I know tonight,
thank you, Jay.
As I mentioned earlier, we've been asked to look at looking at composition. And I know you've sort of revamped a previous presentation for us and brought it right up to date with lots of new material for us, which is great. Nigel, before we get started, let's just talk a little bit about you and your background. Obviously, I've known you for a long time now, and obviously you have Creative Photography Wales. How did you kind of get into the landscape photography, and sort of how did that all start for you?
Bit of a career change, really, Jay. I used to run a charity, an environmental charity, and a bit of a parting of the ways, and I was looking for a total career change. That was back in 2008. I'd done some freelance work before, photographic work, a long time before, but I'd actually left it for quite a while, but got back into it and picked my camera up, bought myself a digital camera because all my previous cameras were, two of them didn't even have a light meter, so very much in the old sort of film days, very basic box that took pictures very well. So got myself up to date and started producing more material and selling my work, and people seem to like it reasonably well. So yeah, and then been teaching it since 2010, so about 7 years now.
Brilliant. Well, yeah, I for one know that you do take a very good picture, Nigel. So I'm a big fan, and it's easy for me to say that. But also, pleased that you agreed to come on board with the academy, and you've been teaching landscapes for us for a long time now. I know we've just recently shot some new films with you, and I know you're going to be out with Sam again soon. So hopefully, we're waiting for a bit more moody skies and a bit more atmosphere to the pictures.
Yeah, less said about that one, the better, Jay.
But no, absolutely. Hand on heart, one of our favourite teachers, and loads of great feedback. So Nigel, obviously we want people to interact with you. You have your landscape workshops. I know you do your one-to-ones as well. So Creative Photography Wales is where to check you out. I'm going to send everybody the links. Obviously, got to like you on Facebook as well.
There's a slide with the details on the end of the presentation as well, Jay. So.
Okay, excellent, mate. Well, look, let's not waste any time. I'm going to send you the screen, and I'll let you know when we can see it. So it's coming over to you now.
Okay.
And just while we're waiting for the screen to come live, guys, as I said, we do want you to interact with us. So please, any questions you have for Nigel, put those through the question panel. I'll put those through to Nigel where appropriate. And as I said, we've allowed plenty of time at the end. Not got anything coming through yet. Nigel, have you had the request through? Just need to press the show my screen button on your end.
Muted. Hang on, I'm unmuted. Show your screen.
There eventually. Nigel, the screen's yours. I can hear you loud and clear. And like I said, I'll chip in with questions, or you just prompt me if you're ready for questions.
Yeah, sure.
All right, pal.
Hi all. Hi all. Well, we've got off to a cracking start, haven't we? So let's hope it picks up from here. Right. So as Jay mentioned, it's as you can see, entitled Creative Composition and Landscape Photography. I've got a few compositional presentations. This one really looks at the fundamentals of composition and takes it a little bit further as well. So it goes into a little bit more depth in terms of what the key elements of composition is about, how you can use those ideas to effectively create stronger and usually simpler images. And I've also got at the end of this a few examples where I've explored an area. So I've got a few alternatives where I've gone from a start point where I've gone to a location, taken some shots, but finally got to the point of the shot that I was looking for, or the shot that I probably saw as being, the ideal, if you like, for that location. So I'll go over those at the end. So if we move on. So what this includes: visual journey, something that takes your eye through the picture. That will become clear when I go through this. Drawing attention to your subject. If you've got a main subject, it's how you maximize the impact of your of that subject, and how you can make it very clear why you took the picture. So a bit of clarity in that one. Experimenting with the point of view. When I talk about point of view, I mean precisely where you hold the camera. Up, down, left, right, towards the sky, down to the ground. All this forms the point of view. And the key thing about that is that a little bit of difference in a point of view of the camera can make a big difference to your image. Format and cropping. Your cameras take 3:2 format cameras shots typically. You needn't use that. You can use all sorts of different formats. So a little bit on that. Compositional balance at the end, and finally the composition examples, which I've just mentioned to you. So all will become clear. So, keys to effective composition. Now this, by the way, is very subjective. just because these are the most important things to me, might not be to you, but this is what I see being particularly important in the kind of imagery that I produce. Simplicity. Good example is that shot. Mist is very good for simple compositions because it obscures detail. There's actually a toilet block in that shot, which of course you can't see because of the mist. So it obscures detail, just picks out the key elements and the key parts of the picture that you want to pick out. So simplicity is a key one. And that really is about being selective. What you include in the frame and what you exclude makes all the difference. I'll be showing you, illustrating plenty of examples of that as we go through. Impact. Conveying your image, conveying what exactly you want from the image, why you're taking the picture in the first place. Fundamental question to ask yourself is, why am I taking this picture? If your answer is, I'm not quite sure, it usually isn't worth taking, and usually the result isn't going to be probably what you're looking for. Compositional balance, this is a little bit subjective, but I'll go through that at the end. And finally, individuality. I think this is probably the most important thing. It's about creating something which is unique to you, which really doesn't mean going to a great spot to take a picture from. Photography can get like that, where you'll join, and I'm sure I've done it, I'm sure most of us have done it, joined a whole load of other photographers at a location and pretty much you've all got the same spot. It's a guaranteed way to stifle creativity. So hopefully I'll give you a few pointers as to where you can start to develop your own style. The main part of that, by the way, is a separate presentation, but I'm going to touch on it in this one. So, what we do at the start, creating a visual journey, compositional tools that will help you take your eye through the picture. So this is quite a good example, the front slide here. The path clearly draws the eye into the landscape. So, how do we do that? Well, lead-in lines. I'm sure that most of you listening have heard of lead-in lines. I'm going to broadly explain how, in my mind, these work. Now, in the majority of the cases that I'm going to show you, the lead-in line actually is the strength of the picture. It's more about, it's not necessarily a lead-in to a subject, but actually it's the line itself that really is the main feature. The one on the top left is a very good example, the sweeping sand disappearing into the distance. So, various ways you can use lead-in lines, so I'll briefly describe these. These are very strong diagonal lead-in lines. Take your eye in and out of the picture very, very quickly. Very strong perspective, very strong lines, the shot in the top corner of the picture, the strong perspective lines of the boarding and of the sky, balancing the composition. The one on the right is taken in snow. I've got some more examples of this one later on. Very strong perspective lines. So all these are about a very immediate, very high impact picture because you're using strong perspective and strong diagonals. Key element of the picture there, usually a wide angle lens. More often than not, I would say a low viewpoint will focus the attention on the foreground and a wide angle lens will really create that sense of drama. So moving on from diagonals, a single curve. Now you might think you don't see these very often, but actually you do. A curve in the road, a curve in a path, number of examples you can see here where a simple curve has added strength to the picture, taking your eye in a slightly more subtle way, if I can go back a little bit, than these diagonal ones, the perspective ones, but still a fairly direct way of taking your eye into the picture. So very much a single dominant curve. And then moving on to more meandering lead-in lines. So quite a different feel to this. Now you'll notice there's quite a different series of landscape features I've used to achieve the meandering lead-in lines. A path, a line in the sand, a river, or even the escarpment of a mountain. They all have the same effect. They all have the effect of taking your eye through the picture. You can see they have a very different character, these pictures. It's a much more gradual, it's a much more, whether you call it static, tranquil, whatever you will, way of taking your eye through the picture, rather than these, which have got much more impact to them. So these are much more subtle. So your eye hangs around a little bit more often in these kind of pictures. Finally, on lead-in lines, implied lead-in lines. So a series of features, which this is not a continuous line here, but there's a series of features that imply a lead-in, whether through a curve or a diagonal line in the case of the top two images. The top two, as you can tell, were both in sandstorms, and I won't be doing this again because last time the one on the left cost me £400 in camera equipment repairs, so be very careful if you're out in sand and wind. The top two pictures, only one distinctive difference between the two in terms of composition. The one on the right has got a stop point. Anyone knows the area, it's the Llanelli Coast Path. That's the visitor centre actually on the right hand side. And the one on the top left is Rhossili, probably quite familiar to a lot of you who live in South Wales. So the only one difference between the left and right pictures in compositional terms, one's got a stop point. Effectively, the lead-in takes you to a point, whereas the one on the left, the one of the Helvetia and Rhossili, doesn't really, you can see Worm's Head in the background, but it's fairly insignificant in terms of forming part of the composition. So you'll see all the different ways you can use lead-in lines. As I mentioned, the main aspect to these, the main key to these images is the lead-in line is a very, very strong part of the composition. They're less of a lead-in to a subject than actually a strong line in themselves. It's the way I tend to use them. The one on the top right there is probably the one more than any other that has a lead-in to a main subject. So another way on the visual journey, now this is in some ways similar, if we go back to the previous slide, similar to this series of features, but it's not an obvious line. What I've done is use a series of features to take your eye through the picture. You'll notice on 4 of them, in fact, the bottom right is similar. On 4 of them, I've started off with a feature with a rock, the feature in the sea, for example, or the boardwalk on the left-hand side of the shot, taking your eye through the picture with a shot in the middle ground and the background. So all of them have used the same compositional idea to take your eye through the picture. A feature on the top left, on the bottom right, sorry, I beg your pardon, bottom left, a feature on the bottom left, a feature in the middle ground on the right-hand side, and the main feature that draws the eye towards in the center ground in the background. So all of them use the same compositional tool, effectively using 3 main features. If you might be interested, quite a variety of different landscape locations here. Old Manor Store on the Isle of Skye, top left, Snowdon, top right, Elgol on the Skye in the center, Shropshire Hills on the bottom left, and Llangorth Lake on the bottom right. So hopefully you can see the similar compositional idea with all these. It's a good idea to try it. Look for 3 features and use them to take your eye through the picture in that kind of way. Also on the visual journey, using foreground, and probably the thing that landscape photographers use more than any other, I would say, is how we use foreground and its relationship with the background. You can see I've used a variety of features here, brightly coloured flowers, the ferns, the grasses, and a shipwreck on the North Yorkshire coast. Very strong colour, very strong use of low viewpoint. What a low viewpoint does, it simplifies the image into foreground and background. So you've got a foreground feature against a background feature. A higher up viewpoint, and I'll show you examples of this in a minute, will open up the landscape more. So the way you can simplify the image is to use a low viewpoint, and it reduces the effect of the middle ground, draws the eye towards the foreground and its relationship to the background. So that in itself leads to a very simple composition. But you'll notice with all these, the foreground feature is quite simple. You've got one subject, either it's a color, it's a shape, or it's a form. It's not a different series of foreground features. It's one simple foreground feature. Generally that works best. So try and keep your foreground simple. And also think about the lens that you're using as well. It's very easy to reach for the widest angle lens you've got. Now that will emphasize the foreground, but it will exaggerate the scale of the foreground in relation to the background, to the point where your background feature is actually fairly minimal. That's actually the case in the shot at the shipwreck there. The shipwreck is about 5-6 meters wide probably. The rock in the background is about 25 meters high. It's called the Black Nab. It's on the North Yorkshire coast, as I mentioned. But you don't get that sense of scale from that picture. So visually, it's quite a strong picture, but it doesn't represent reality. So think about the effect that you want from your picture. Do you want to represent more, which is more closely related to reality, in which case step back and use a longer focus lens, or do you want that the emphasis to be on a striking, strong foreground? That choice is yours and nobody else's. So, few key elements on using foreground here. My other presentation, by the way, has got a lot more on foreground. It goes into a lot more detail, but this is a bit of an overview. So simplicity, one key feature. Portrait format emphasis is a very good way of emphasizing foreground and its relationship with the background. Depth of field usually, which means effectively using a small aperture, focusing is a different matter, but effectively you're focusing, people refer to as a third into the frame, but you're using what we call the hyperfocal distance. So effectively, usually in this kind of situation, you want depth of field. You want your foreground to be in focus and you want the background to be in focus. And as I mentioned earlier, more often than not using a low viewpoint. Jay, are there any questions at that point? I've reached a bit of I should have mentioned right at the start, actually. I tend to break this up into chunks with questions in the middle.
No, that's fine. We've got a couple of questions, actually, Nigel, that it'd be worth addressing at this point. The first question that came through, which I thought was quite interesting, do you feel safe when getting into some of these lonely places with all your camera gear? And do you go really early or later in the day?
Cool. Never even thought about that one, Jay. Do I feel safe? I think so. Yeah. Yes. I can't think I've ever felt. The only place where you could, I suppose, can feel vulnerable is up in mountains. I mean, they are exposed places. It's best not to go into them if you're not an experienced mountain walker and not used to rapidly changing conditions. Wrap up well and rather wear waterproof clothing, wear the right footwear. The other location that you have to be careful on is coastal locations. Tides can come in very, very quickly in particular. So often in coastal locations, you're often safer when the tide's going out, not coming in. You can control it then. When it's coming in, it can come in incredibly quickly. Quite easy to get stranded. So I wouldn't say I don't feel safe because I'm used to doing it. But there are potential hazards in being in some of these locations, I would say. Possibly not the two on these slides, a poppy field and an urban street in Isleworth in London. But in a lot of the locations I go to, I would say, yeah, you have to be on your guard. Sorry, Jay, what was the second question? You had another one, didn't you?
Oh, was it? Well, I don't know if it was related to safety, but whether it was, would you advise better earlier in the morning or later in the day?
Oh, yeah. To an extent, yes. A lot of my images are taken early and late, but equally, a lot of my images depend on drama in the sky and the light coming down from above, lighting up the landscape. They can be, without being in any time of day, certainly 3-4 hours into day or after sunrise or before sunset, because then you get the light penetrating down from above when you're looking for dramatic light. So I certainly am not one of those people that stick to the golden hours, that's for sure, because there's so much more to light to be used. Also in black and white, for example, a lot of black and white imagery is on cloud texture on overcast days, works well in black and white. That virtually can be all day. So it's more a question of the weather conditions rather than the time of day in that respect.
Brilliant. Oh, this was quite a nice question. How many of the images, and actually the words are, how many of your brilliant images were...
Oh, thank you whoever asked the question.
Well, Ted did. Well, I asked the question, but he did, and that's his words. The brilliant, yeah. And I second that. How many of them are serendipity, or how many of you researched and planned?
Serendipity, virtually always. When I research and plan pictures, it never works. I wouldn't say it never works out. All my if I was going to pick out my 50 favorite shots, not one of them are planned. So I have planned pictures. My best work undoubtedly was when I just go out on spec spontaneously, virtually exclusively, I would say. When I start to plan, my work becomes predictable and it changes because you've got some preconception. Generally, you end up going to locations. As I mentioned right at the outset, one of the things that's really easy to do is to go to great places to take pictures from. And the first thing that happens there is you stifle creativity because you've got your mind fixed on this location, and it's usually a location which has been done to death 1,000 times before. The best way to go out, in my experience, is to go with an open mind and explore. And that's what works for me.
Brilliant. Do you ever, if I read this right, this is the second part of the same question, do you ever dress a set, add in anything to it? I presume that in landscapes it's probably just the foliage and the scenery, I guess, so I don't think...
So what was the question, Jay? I didn't quite catch it.
I'm not sure if I'm reading it right. Apart from obviously the research or the serendipity and the research part, the second part of the question is, do you ever dress a set adding to what you see at the time?
Dress a set?
Does that mean...
Does that mean use props?
I guess, yeah.
No. Oh, I suppose I might remove the odd twig or branch or piece of litter. and also I'll occasionally remove people with long exposures who I don't want in the scene, or occasionally remove an errant car in post-processing, something like that. Yeah. So that's the only thing I'll ever do.
So nothing major, like a stone.
I will never remove anything permanent.
Yeah, brilliant.
What I will do is things which actually get in the way, and I haven't, for example, if the light's about to change and I haven't got time to, therefore there isn't time for whatever that temporary thing is to go, I will find various ways of removing it if it detracts from the scene.
Yeah, and actually Ted, who asked the question, that's what he meant. Are you just sort of doing the small things? Excellent, brilliant.
Yeah. It's the small things, yeah.
Your take on, and I'm not sure if we've addressed this before, I'm sure we have in many of our presentations, but do you use photo stacking to get your depth of field, or
no?
No,
I don't. No, if you get your focal point right in the right place with a wide-angle lens, and you've got a relatively small aperture, you've got enormous depth of field if you choose the right spot. But it is always useful to check that you've got the right spot. Check it at 100% when you're taking the picture. I always do. Before going, just to make sure I've got it right. It is, I get it wrong just like everybody else. So yeah, check it at 100% front to back.
Brilliant.
And typically I'll be using f/16 in that situation.
I know we've talked about it in the past, and I'm sure, but one of the sort of golden questions that's come through really, how much attention do you actually pay to the rule of thirds and sort of the traditional sort of emphasis on the way to take a photograph, or are you happy to break rules where and when appropriately?
I'm about to come on to that, Jay. If that's
excellent. Okay, well let's keep that one in. That's fine. Brilliant.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to see if we've missed anything. Then, are you pretty much always using a tripod, Nigel?
Nope.
No? Okay. Oh, actually, sorry. Actually, I misread the question. I misread the question totally. How do you get the low shots? Are you always on a tripod? Obviously not.
No, indeed. No. The rule is, if I can get the image I want at the shutter speed and aperture I want, handheld, I will handhold because it's much quicker and much more flexible than using a tripod. If the shutter speed I need to use, if the aperture I need to use or the light level is at a point where I cannot handhold, because either I need to use a too slow shutter speed or I want to do a long exposure and therefore I'll deliberately low motion, then of course I'll use a tripod. But if, as I said earlier, if I can get the shutter speed and aperture I want, handheld, I will.
Excellent.
Because it's quicker.
Just last couple of questions before we move on. What would your maximum zoom range, what was the maximum zoom range you would use, Nigel?
I tend to rarely go above 200.
There we go.
So you're talking about 200 millimeters.
Yeah.
So in terms of longest focal length.
Brilliant. This was an interesting question actually, and obviously I know the answer to this because I know you, but it's interesting. It must be from the images we're looking at tonight and obviously your crops, but somebody felt that, are you using a medium format camera? Because obviously we're showing some square crops, but
oh, I've just cropped them. I've just cropped them. Yeah.
So
I have actually got a medium. I have got a medium format camera, and actually, it's really easy. It's interesting that that question has been asked. It's really easy to shoot to the shape of the picture in the viewfinder or in the camera. But see it as a starting point. At the end of this, we've got there's a short section on cropping, and but it's all too easy just to look at the shape of the camera and shoot to that shape. Think more flexibly than that. Think about the picture you want to create. Will it be a square image, or will it be a rectangle, or will it be a panoramic?
Brilliant. And that's all of the questions for the time being, mate.
Good, because we probably got to get on actually, otherwise we won't finish.
Indeed, pal.
Okay, right, moving on then. This one's called drawing attention to your subject. So if you've got a main subject, it's how you use compositional ideas and tools to draw attention to it. So there's a few thoughts here. Right, related to the question that Jay was about to ask me, rule of thirds. So for those of you who haven't heard of this, and I would guess the majority of people listening to this probably have, if you imagine your picture as your frame as a noughts and crosses board, that game that you had to be really stupid to lose it, and you put your main subject effectively on one of the intersections of the noughts and crosses, you're using effectively the rule of thirds. Now all these effectively use that idea. So what you do, you're placing the main subject on what is recognized as a visually balanced location in the picture, and then using it to create context. So you're effectively using the main subject to draw the eye beyond into the scene. The top two have just got one main subject. One's the Severn Bridge and the old Severn Bridge, and one's a tree, obviously. The ones on the bottom create a slightly different kind of composition in that they have two main subjects set up on a diagonal, the sun and the shape point and the two climbers. So I've used the rule of thirds in a different way. So as you can see, effectively, you'll find yourself using this quite a lot. I tend to use it subconsciously, but the key thing is that you're creating context. You're drawing the eye from your main subject to the background. However, if we move on to where you wouldn't want it to apply, if you want the eye to be drawn straight to, say, a central feature, for example, like Big Ben, the Pillars Pier, the swan in the middle of the lake, or the castle, all these examples, I wanted the main subject to be in the frame because I wanted the eye to be drawn straight to it. And that's the way you're going to maximize impact on the main subject by putting it in the middle. So it's not a hard and fast rule. Think about, before you use the thirds or not, think about the effect you want from your image and what's going to achieve, well, one, the effect you want from your image, how you want to create impact on your main subject, and what is going to be compositionally balanced. These would not look balanced if I use the rule of thirds on any of these shots. So think about how you're using it. And with these as well, I wouldn't use the rule of thirds with these either. You obviously recognize the shot again from I've used from the cover at the start. All these have got a central main subject. So everything about the composition is an element of symmetry, using the foreground to draw the eye to the central main feature. Again, rule of thirds would lead to an imbalanced composition. So hopefully this helps answer the question that Jay asked me a minute ago in terms of whether I apply the rule of thirds or not. The answer is yes, when I feel it's appropriate and when it achieves the result that I want from my image. If it doesn't, if it detracts from the effect I want, I don't use it. I use usually a central main subject. And oh, there's more actually. There's another slide showing another collection of central main subjects. So all this effectively using the foreground to draw the eye to the background where the main subject is more or less in the middle of the frame. So you'll see all these compositionally are very, very similar. Strong foreground, portrait format, single clear background feature. All these apply the same way. If you want to practice simple compositions, this is the easiest way of doing it. Choose portrait format because you get a closer relationship between foreground and background than you do in landscape format, generally. Try and use a simple foreground, as simple as possible, whether it's a simple pattern, texture, color, whatever it is, and a single main subject in the background, and try and use an arrangement that leads to a simple composition. It helps train the eye to look for simplicity. Hopefully you'll get the idea from all these is that they aren't general pictures of with a number of features in them. Generally, most of them are very simple, either, as I mentioned, texture, color, shape, form, what have you. They're all very, very similar. So I'm going to cover this very briefly, framing, because it doesn't, I don't think, applies particularly to landscape photography, but I've got a few examples here. One obviously is not even a landscape photograph. So framing. You can draw attention to your subject using framing. Doorways, the top right is a spiral staircase, the part of a ruin at Llanthony Priory, if anyone knows it, in South Wales, help frame the background. But it isn't something I find I use a huge amount in landscape photography. Be wary of introducing clutter. Now, the overhanging tree branch is the classic framing device. It generally will clutter. It's fine for a picture postcard, you know, a nice sort of scenic view of a church or something in the background with a tree branch overhanging it. But if you're looking for simple compositions, generally it will lead to clutter. So I don't tend to use that. Can look also quite prosaic as well. When you do use it, I would suggest you probably use it to frame architecture or structure rather than a landscape. The two don't tend to go particularly well together. So other ways you can draw attention to your subject. Highlights. I use this quite a lot. You can see from all these that I've got a very clear highlight in the picture. The eye, because it's where it's placed, is placed within the frame. The surroundings, the edges of the frame are darker, so it draws the eye in. I use this a lot, so I've come up with 4 pictures here. I could have come up with 200. I use this an awful lot, and a lot of them are backlit, so the light source is contained within the picture, and it's a very strong, striking, high contrast light. So composing for highlights is probably the thing which I think it's the kind of light I tend to look for, contrasty, quite dramatic light, and you can see the effect it achieves. A few examples where they haven't gone so well. So I thought I'd pitch in a few compositional anomalies. With all these, they are not particularly comfortable in terms of, it's not clear what the main subject is. With 3 of them, in fact with all of them, there are 2 potentially competing with a bit of a gap in the middle. So the picture of the swan and the visitor centre, the swan's facing out. Well, convention says you have the subject facing in, but the other 3, you've got 2 rock features, effectively, well, mountains or rock features, with a bit of a gap in the middle. So there's no clear idea of what the main subject is, or in fact why those pictures have been taken. It can be a problem, particularly with coastal photography, where you've got all the detail on one side, particularly taken from a high top of a high cliff. You've got all the detail on one side, and you've got the sea on the other side. There's nothing to balance the composition. So that kind of imbalance can occur with coastal photography. Anyone who knows Skye as well, the top left picture is taken on the Kwarang, or Karang, I think it's pronounced, and it's a great spot. Very difficult to photograph well, simply because you've got quite an imbalanced landscape with a big gap on either side or the other. So think about the content of your picture, what the focus is. I've got an example in the next slide how you can see how one picture, I've used that picture again, the one on the top left, not a strong picture, no real point of focus. And a very similar type of scene, one of the foreground is used foreground more strongly. The light on the mountains is better, which is draw the eye into a single point in the background, and it's used a strong foreground. So I've just by using those 2 devices, I've strengthened the picture from the one on the top left-hand side. So hopefully you can all see why I think generally in those pictures fail, because it's not clear why they've been taken, and it's not clear of the point of focus. I'm going to go through, before asking any more questions, Jay, I'll go through this one and go to the next one. So experimenting with your point of view. Now, these are a few, I'm going to go through the examples, there's more specific examples, and you'll see the one on the left again. But briefly on this, I mentioned your point of view is precisely where you hold the camera, up, down, low viewpoint, high viewpoint, exactly where you hold it. So top picture, it's not clear. You've got a mix of light and shadow. You've got a disparate foreground, which it looks confused. Just by stepping back a bit and using a slightly lower viewpoint, you can see that the foreground is much clearer. It's much clearer why it's been taken. It's caught the light on the frosted grass. The other thing about those pictures as well, the timing was quite important, because 5 minutes earlier, all that was in shadow. 10 minutes later, all the shadow was filled in. So the timing is quite important. I actually forgot to take the before and after pictures, which I should have done at the time. So the timing as well, but the main point about that is where I held the camera and how I formed the foreground. I'll expand on that in a minute. The ones on the right-hand side, 3, 4, and 5, just experimenting with, another one on the outer sky, just experimenting with various positions. The top two, in fact, were the first ones I saw, but eventually I found one which I preferred, which was the one with a single flow of water running diagonally through the picture. I think it forms a stronger composition. Now, probably if I hadn't seen that one, I would have been happy with the top one, but I've got a stronger image out of it, simply by exploring with the camera and walking around and not necessarily just going with the obvious. The next slide is options. A rock outcrop in Snowdonia, taken from, there's a ridge coming down off Snowdon, looking back down the valley. And you'll see that I've got the rock formation on the right-hand side, the majority of it's on the right, and on the left. And the one on the bottom left-hand side, it's not, the emphasis isn't either one way or the other. Generally, we prefer, and this is a generalization, we prefer the emphasis to be on the left-hand side. So we prefer the rocks to be on the left, which means, rather strangely, it's the pictures I've now got on the right, on the hand side of the frame, of course. We tend to prefer that composition, the pictures on the right-hand side, than we do the ones on the left. We tend, because we read from left to right, and we do prefer emphasis of one side or the other, whereas the one on the bottom left-hand side looks a little bit, it doesn't quite know what it's focusing on. So think about that. Think about there's no wrong or right about it, but think about the effect of your picture when you're choosing a viewpoint and choosing the options. Using low viewpoints, touched on this before, but there's a few more examples. You'll see with all of these, there's a very strong foreground and there's a very strong background. So simple composition of foreground and background, all using a low viewpoint. As I mentioned earlier, what a low viewpoint will do, will close down the picture, the scene. Effectively, it will reduce the scene into your foreground feature against the background feature. A higher viewpoint, which I'm going to show you in a second, opens the landscape up. So with these examples, I wanted to open the landscape up for two reasons. The light on the landscape was hitting the middle ground. The middle ground there, therefore, in these pictures, was the key element of it. It isn't the foreground. If you look at the top two pictures, the foreground's nothing. It's just rough grass, some sheep, and a farm on the one on the left. But the key aspect of the picture is on the central ground. So therefore, the high viewpoint suited this picture as opposed to the low viewpoint, which emphasizes foreground. Also, high viewpoints are very good for picking out detail. The three bottom pictures are all taken with a telephoto lens. In answer to the question earlier, these are more of a longer focal length, up to about 200 millimeters I mentioned I use. All these are about that. So high viewpoints also, combined with a telephoto lens, are very good at picking out the details in the landscape. So if we look at the difference between them, emphasis on the foreground, its relationship with the background, with a low viewpoint, and higher viewpoint opens up the landscape and gives you a different style of shot, and this is down to either picking out detail or the light in the middle ground. looking upwards. These are more architectural than landscape shots, of course. There's not much landscape in the sky, but just a different way you can look at point of view. Now you'll see that I've used diagonals quite strongly in these as well. By the way, the one on the top left is in fact it's a roof in Basel in Switzerland, just near a railway station. It's a shopping centre, I think. So it's quite an interesting architectural feature. So you'll see that pointing the camera up to the sky can produce a very different style of composition. This is quite useful to do. If you've got a location that you know and offers photographic potential, pay it a visit and see how many different ways you can photograph it. The one on the top right is a very literal shot. Shows its scale, shows its size, and shows its location. Those are people, by the way, so he's pretty big. He's about 23 meters high, I think. Shows his location. He's actually in a place called Six Bells, Abertillery in the Welsh Valleys. He was built as a mining memorial. He's called the Guardian. The others are more interpretive. They're more of an individual take on him, but you don't know his scale and you don't necessarily know his location. So think about different ways of exploring a subject, but also think about the realistic, the literal shot as well, because in some ways the interpretive shots need the literal shot to give it context. So have a look at it, think about location near you and just experiment with your camera. Format and cropping. Jay, any questions at that point?
We do actually. Probably a good point just to catch up on some of these before we get too far ahead. We had a couple of people ask, obviously you've shown quite a few images a bit earlier on. I know it's one of your styles about the sort
do you want me to go back?
Well, it's the zoom effect in the clouds that a few people have been asking about, and obviously how you actually get the effect. Is it long exposure or is it in software?
Oh, they should have heard my previous presentation, shouldn't they, Jay?
Indeed. Yeah, they're the ones we're looking at. There we go.
Yeah, right, that one you mean. Okay, they're all long exposures. Wind direction either coming towards the camera or away from the camera. So you get the cloud movement coming your way. That's how that's done. I never do that in post-processing.
Brilliant. Now, Nigel, there is a question here about a specific. I wouldn't jump too far because I think it's about one of the images. There's an image of the harbour. It's in the bottom right. I think it was when you were talking about highlights.
Is it that one?
I think so. Let's see if Mary's there and just confirm that this is the image. It says bottom right, so I think it's this one. What lens and focal length did you use? Because it looks slightly fisheye, so it must be that image, I think.
Yeah, it's a panoramic photo merge. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay.
It's blended images.
So
yeah, that's actually 5 shots that in one.
okay.
So it gives it does give a kind of fisheye effect if you use a wide-angle lens, because what that will do effectively, and I've got a separate presentation on photo merges, what it will do, a wide-angle lens, it will stretch out the foreground but keep the background roughly in proportion. So what you'll get it is the exaggerated foreground will create that kind of effect when you blend them.
So with regards to taking the initial images, what kind of focal length and settings are you thinking, Nigel?
That's taken at around, I'd need to check exactly, but it's taken wide to start off with. So on a full frame, about 16 millimeters, which is a pretty wide angle.
Excellent.
And then blended and then added together.
Okay, Nigel, I've got a question here. This is actually you can get back ready for your cropping section, but I thought this was a really interesting question to ask. So somebody asking for some help and advice, really. They live in an area that's very woodlands. They love walking it. They love taking pictures, and it typically has some very small, say 20 meter diameter ponds in there. How would you approach catching this image? If you've got any tips or advice? My first reaction was reflections, because I think I'm quite a lot.
Woodlands are really hard. I tend to shoot against the light in woodlands. Rays of sun coming through trees. So try and go for, the ponds are great for reflections, fine. Low viewpoints, make sure that the lower you have the camera, the better the reflection will be. Because firstly you're reducing the scale of the middle ground and the effect of the surface of the water, and secondly, the the closer to the edge of the pond, the more still the water is, and therefore that's where the camera is getting most of its detail. So put the camera as low as you can possibly get it, close to the water, if you're photographing the ponds. And yeah, typically a wide-angle lens will give you obviously a wider view. As I mentioned, the other way I photograph woodlands quite often, because they are quite difficult to photograph. They can be quite cluttered. Try and find a single foreground feature. Try and find light coming through trees and use the shadow of the trees towards the camera, and you'll get some quite interesting backlighting effects.
Great advice. Nigel knows this, and obviously some of you won't be aware of this, but I shoot quite a lot of infrared photography, and it's actually one of the things that I love my woodland walks with. But I am looking, when I do that, I'm very looking for really strong, bright days to give me the shadows and the casts.
Or alternatively, don't forget, particularly in spring or autumn, you get colour as well, and they're great. They're great for macro photography. Different style of photography completely, but close-ups. You know, a lot of natural shots. So think about, on a dull day, a different approach. You're focusing more on detail.
Yeah, it could be a nice seasonal project, that, couldn't it? So you can take your personal favourite sort of walkway, your walks, and sort of make a year-long project out of it. Brilliant, nice. That's everything. So I've got a few that I'm hanging on to that are more general questions. So let's crack on, pal.
Going to keep an eye on the time as well. It's about 5 to 8, isn't it, Jay? Yeah, it's about 5 to 8. So to get through. Okay, we've been through this. Let me just go back to where I started from. Bear with me. It was here, wasn't it? Okay, this is quite a short section anyway. Format and cropping. Portrait or landscape format does depend on the effect you want from the picture, of course. As I mentioned before, portrait format, you get a stronger relationship between foreground and background. So if you want simple compositions, then portrait format is a very good format to use, and it's a very good format to practice with, because effectively in landscape format you get more context. So if you're selling pictures, looking at the top two as an example, editors will often want negative space. If they want space, they can put clear space, they can put text in. So think about that as well if you're selling your work. Clear space is good. There's nothing worse than trying to read text on complex backgrounds. People do it and you just can't read it. So I often shoot both. If I'm looking for got a scene like the ones that you can see here, I will often shoot in both. Cropping, I've used the same image just to show, as previously, just to show it can be cropped in several different ways. You'll see the top two. The full frame image included detail that detracted, not added to the image. Now the usual thing, if you look at the one with Glencoe on the right hand side, it's too easy to add foreground to think you'll actually add a foreground feature as to act as a base for the picture. But that picture was all about the light coming through the mountains. So that foreground was detracted from the scene, so I cropped it. The line of trees was just that, the light coming through the line of trees. The detail on the top and bottom detracted from that. So think about the effect you want from your picture and whether any element of the picture detracts from it. If it detracts, crop it. Usually with cropping, have a mind of what you want out of the image, rather than when you get back, oh, I wonder what that's going to look like cropped. Have in your mind the cropped image when you're taking it. Square compositions, a few examples here. You'll notice that boardwalk one I've used again, but it actually works because it works quite well square because of the arrangement of the shot. So effectively, when you've got that kind of arrangement, a very clear central focus for the picture, square format can work quite well. So again, don't be frightened to crop square, and think in terms of taking square shots as well. Compositional balance, this is the last section before I'm going to go through a few examples. Compositional balance, so just a different few ways in which you can get a balanced composition. The shot of the Forth rail bridge, a very popular spot, needs the rock on the left-hand side. Otherwise, the bridge would almost look as though it was disappearing into the river. The shot of the sand pattern, which I know I've used a couple of times, but you'll see that balance between light and shade is very strong. The light in the center of the image balanced roughly about half and half with the darker shadow areas, top, bottom, left and right. The line of trees, you can see the line, the one I showed you last time, very clearly bottom left to top right, it's about balanced. Two of them symmetrical, I'm going to come on to horizon line in a second. And the top left picture, I've used effectively the wall of the dam to wrap itself round the landscape. So that's a panoramic photo merge. It's a good example of a stretched out one where a wide angle lens has stretched out the foreground and contained the landscape. So it's helped hold the landscape in and achieve a balanced composition at the same time. Horizon line, as I mentioned, think about the effect you want from your picture. My other compositional presentation has got a lot more on where we put horizon lines and the effect that has. But this is a very brief summary. If you've got the sky dominating, then obviously a low horizon. If you've got the landscape that you want to place emphasis on, then a higher horizon line. And if you think that compositional balance, I know I've used that picture again, I think I probably need to substitute it for something else a couple of times. If you want the horizon, the sky and land to have equal balance, don't be afraid to put the horizon line in the middle. I know we talk about horizon lines being a third up or a third down, generally something to ignore. It's the effect you want from the picture. The top examples, for example, my horizon line is lower because it places more emphasis. It's lower than a third because it places more emphasis on the sky. So that's one of those rules, a bit like the thirds. Fine to use it, but think about why you're using it and the result and effect you want from your picture. It's your picture after all. So yeah, so use that with caution. And finally, I think it is finally, let me just go on to the next, yeah, it is. Just thinking in abstract. Now, my other presentation includes a lot more in abstract compositions, where you're thinking purely in terms of shape or form. So all these are about simple lines, simple shapes. They're usually taken with a telephoto because they're very good at extracting detail from a wider landscape. So they flow quite well, these pictures. Very simple shapes and very simple forms. So they're about being selective. They're about observation. Go around with your camera with a telephoto lens and just look around and pick out these details from all that's around you. So the selective aspect of these is very important. Right, before I go on to the composition examples, Jay, which I'm going to spend about 10 minutes on, have you got any other questions? Or shall I go straight on?
Only a quick one, handful. Well, not even that. One that I'd like to ask before I forget, because it came through the chat panel and not through the normal question panel. Going back to the serendipity and capturing the images, how often when do you see? Is it often then that you're on location, you see a shot come in, say the clouds or the skies and so on, and are you then sort of dashing to find the right viewpoint, or you kind of know?
Oh, can be, yeah, definitely.
Okay.
And sometimes get it wrong and sometimes miss it and swear like crazy and yeah.
Okay, so there's an element of either you pick your viewpoint and hope the sky comes, or you can see it come in, and so
yeah, there can be there is the downside of probably not planning everything in advance is that inevitably with changing light, then yes, inevitably, of course, that some you're going to get, some you're other, but some you're not. But yeah, absolutely, yeah, you can certainly miss shots, that's for sure.
That's it, mate. So let's go through the examples, and then we'll do anything we've got left then at the end.
Okay, right. Okay, so just a few comparative examples here. Effectively, how you can get from what potentially can be a mundane shot to a much more interesting one. So a few examples on a canal bank on the opposite side of the road from my house. Top left, it's just some daffodils on a canal bank. Taken from a quite obvious viewpoint, just a few daffodils, nothing to write home about at all. But try using firstly a lower viewpoint, a wider angle lens closer to the foreground daffodils, which places emphasis on the foreground, and you'll get much stronger images. So effectively what the top example has done is effectively turn the image into bands of color, the green, the yellow, the white, and the blue. So it ceases to become a collection of daffodils on a canal bank. Then I went back a couple of days later and shot against the light, so with the sun right into the camera. So completely quite a strong effect by doing that. You'll need a graduated filter to do that, otherwise the sun and clouds will blow out. So that needs filtration. But you can see just by using a little bit more imagination, you can get a much more interesting shot than a basic shot of, as I mentioned, canals on a canal bank. Next one, taken just down the road in Longhorse Lake. I've shown you the one on the right-hand side a few times. I quite like that. There's a quite nice progression between the boardwalk, the boat, and the backdrop, and it uses that progression of one side of the frame, taking your eye to the other side of the frame, and then back through. It helps walk your eye through the picture. The others are a few others I took on the same day. So you can see they all fail in various ways. The triangular shape at the bottom and on the top left-hand side, the boat in the middle of the frame. I don't have a problem particularly in the boat in the middle of the frame, by the way, as in itself. That can work very well. But it appears slightly in the middle of nowhere. It did help, by the way, that the boat moved all the time, and it happened to move to a spot that it worked for me, looking at the picture on the right-hand side. But because the boat was obviously attached to a rope, and it seemed to just move. I didn't touch it, by the way. It did move of its own accord. So you can see the others. They're a bit haphazardly placed. The one in the top, on the top in the middle, the line of the edge of the jetty is too vertical, so it jars a little bit. It's not much of an angle. You've got the rope of the boat, the one in the bottom left, the boat in the middle of the mist. It's all a little bit, there's not enough to take your eye through the picture. So you can see that actually I tried a few examples at different viewpoints, different positions, different lenses, different perspectives, and eventually got one that I was happy with, one effectively that created depth and took your eye through the picture, which the others failed to do. You'll notice I use portrait format as well, which I think works much more successfully. These I showed you a minute ago, so I won't go into any great detail, but just to show you again the options of how I got to the shot I wanted. The shot I wanted was this one with the light on the frosted grass, pick the way the rising sun picked the grass out. The others on the left-hand side, both just shows a line of grass in sunlight. This is before the sun came up properly, so the sun was lower, so it didn't catch all the grass. So you'll see it just effectively what you get is a line of light, and the rest of it's in shadow. Doesn't work as well, and I've showed you the one on the bottom. On the right-hand side, it's rather haphazard, so you can see the change when the sun comes up. So be patient and see what happens. I've got a couple of examples from Glencoe, just experimenting with foreground. First one, some rocks, top left-hand side, standard shot, rocks in the foreground, not much to write home about. The whole landscape was lit, and the cloud gradually filled in. So I started to get some more interesting shots. Just picked out some rocks to feature, a little bit shapeless, a little bit formless, just a base for the picture. The key element of this picture is the what's called the buckle, Bachylatif Moor. That's Gaelic, I don't know the exact pronunciation. So that's the main focus of the picture. It's quite a, if you go to Glencoe, it's a fantastic mountain. It does stand out. So you'll see the light began to get a little bit more interesting. I was able to pick out, the clouds came over and the light got more dramatic. Now the one on the top right-hand side, the whole foreground is still lit, and the foreground hasn't got any particular focus. And I caught my eye was drawn to the bridge, the light on the bridge. Now on the left-hand side, again, the light was on most of the landscape, but the light then just went on the bridge and the foreground became more in shadow, so it picked the bridge out much more clearly. So it just highlighted a part of the landscape that, to my mind, had much more drama than the whole lot being lit. And I found a much more distinctive feature than, for example, the rocks or the grasses that you can see on the left-hand side. Few more taken at Glencoe on the same day. So you'll see that I went down to the river, the one I saw some potential in the froth in the water. The first one on the bottom left-hand side, it doesn't quite know whether it's of the stones or the froth. So you've got a rock in the middle, you've got the stones on one side, on the left-hand side, the froth on the right-hand side. It's not clear what my focus is on, which I'm trying to photograph. So I decided I need to focus on the froth. Now the other thing you can see from these shots, I added a polarizing filter. So the polarizing filter has made the surface underneath the water much, much clearer. It's taken a lot of the reflection away from the sky. You can see instantly the effect is much red, a much darker red. So I've become more, I've taken a more selective view by focusing on the froth on the water, and I've used a polarizing filter to bring out what's underneath. And finally, I thought I actually get more interesting effect, or more close to what I visualized by converting to black and white. So I've picked out the whites of the froth and the mountain very centrally focused. So it's a very clear central feature. It's very similar to a number of examples I showed you earlier of a foreground texture or foreground feature against a background, a very simple composition. So got a couple on this day, got a couple of varieties of pictures just by being selective and waiting either for the light to change or changing my shooting position to get more the effect that I wanted. These ones, taking the freight shelves, I use this shot, a cover shot at the start. Nondescript, the mist gathered in the valley, I saw some potential for a shot. A bit like the daffodil example, this one, in terms of using a low viewpoint, being more clear on the foreground, so had some grasses in the top left-hand picture, not particularly distinctive. Then walked over towards some flowers and saw obviously a much stronger picture, and went very low down in the flowers, so they were higher up in the picture and they were larger in the scale to the background in comparison to the images at the top. So you can see just by exploring with the camera and looking for various views, I got a much stronger image, the one on the bottom right. You saw this picture before. I just thought I'd show you a couple of other examples of how I got there. First shot I took taken a few years ago, this one, by the way. It hasn't snowed in Langorse Lake for a while now. Top left-hand side in landscape format. I tried to get a starburst effect out of the sun. I quite like the effect. Didn't like landscape format. Didn't convey the strong perspective effect that I wanted out of the shot. And also it introduced some clutter on the right-hand side. A car, the rocks, the tracks in the snow. So I changed to portrait format and shot more against the trees with the shadows coming strongly from the trees, a bit like the woodland example I just gave to Jay a minute ago. And a bit like the Glencoe shot showed you a minute ago, that one turned to black and white because the color, particularly the blues, detracted, I think, from the effect I wanted, which is very strong drama, very contrasty, which I think worked well in black and white. And the one I actually chose didn't use the starburst of the sun at all. It obscured the sun behind the tree, and I think it worked much more strongly than the other examples. This one, a straw field in Raglan. The two probably I want to pick out here are the main one I use, which is the one on the top right-hand side, the one faintly edged in orange. That's the shot I wanted. Now, the closest to it is the shot on the bottom left, but you can see on the left-hand side, there's actually a conflicting infinity point. So right on the edge of the frame, you've actually got the lines of the straw field leading to a conflicting point, which takes your eye away from the path, which was my main point behind taking the picture. So with the one on the top right, I've just got that strong path line, the eye with a strong diagonal, taking the eye in that direction, but yes, just used the field as a contrasting texture and made sure that I've effectively taken that conflicting infinity point out of the shot. I think this is the last one. Yes, it is. Right. So a few points at a location I often take my customers to at the Severn Bridge. It's a great spot. This is the second Severn crossing. Now the key point about these shots is the positioning on the bridge and the effect on the alignment of the structure itself. You can see that if you go you're too far away from the structure, it flattens out the diagonal line. So you end up with not a particularly strong curve in the bridge. If you go too close to the bridge, it straightens it too much. So you end up with a rather uncomfortable line which looks too strongly vertical in the frame. I prefer the one which is about in the bottom right, which is about 45 degrees on a diagonal, which seems to, in terms of compositional balance, it's a more, to my mind, it works better as a curve and actually demonstrates the engineering of the bridge more clearly. Takes your eye through the picture more strongly. So I tend to go for the one on the bottom right. But just to show you, just a few subtle examples in your position can make quite a difference in the composition. Obviously, I chose some quite different days here: low tide, high tide, and an extremely stormy day as well. So that's the end of the examples. I think that's the end of the presentation. It is. So what have I learned from this? Just to summarize what I've gone through, I've shown you some compositional ideas, lead-in lines, using foreground, using framing, using those basic compositional ideas which probably most people have heard of, and shown you perhaps that you can apply them or you don't apply them depending on the effect you want from the picture. Be selective, be very clear about why you're taking the picture, and exclude things, any aspect of it, the scene that's in front of you, which detracts from that effect. Be very clear on the point of view that you use and experiment. So try different options in the as in the examples I've shown you. Think of composition as designing your image rather than taking a picture. Hopefully I've got the idea across that a lot of these pictures, they're very clear why they've been taken. They include very few subjects, a simple foreground, a simple background, and they're very clear in content and form, and often color as well. And finally, I always say that's the end of my presentations, come on a Creative Photography Wales workshop. So those are my contact details at the end: email, website, and telephone numbers. And with that, Jay, it's back to you.
Thank you, Nigel, so much. Thanks coming through on the question panel for tonight's presentation. And again, you know, I've sat through many a presentation with you, but you never cease to amaze me. So learned some new ones tonight, mate. So thank you for that. Great presentation. I'll read you some in a second. Let's just do the last few questions out of the way. Do you use OS maps when you're shooting, or are you just using public footpaths and fields, or do you just shoot locations regardless?
I always have maps with me, must admit. I'm a bit old school, me. I always have maps. I can't read little maps on a phone or anything like that. No, I carry maps, old paper ones. Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Always.
I think it was a good point that we made earlier.
In fact, can I expand on that?
Of course.
I think that's really important. It's a really good question. I'm glad somebody asked that because I wouldn't have thought of it. The first thing I always take with me, I don't think I ever go to locations without having a map, because I can then walk where I want, go where I want, follow my map, and explore. Absolutely, always take a map.
Brilliant. This question just come in just at the end here, which is quite nice. Love the presentation, love your landscapes, but what would you shoot if you didn't shoot landscapes?
Ooh. I like architecture. You can see there's quite a lot of architectural content in my. I'm trained as an architect, by the way. So I previous life. I like shape and form. Modern buildings have got very strong shape and form. Architecture, engineering, structures, that kind of thing. I tend to go for them more than old buildings, to be honest with you, because they are very well designed, and it tends to go with my way of thinking. So I'd probably be an architectural photographer and actually do some architecture as well.
Brilliant. Nigel, I wanted to touch on this, and I think we definitely touched on it in previous presentations with you, and I know in your films as well, but we were talking quite early on tonight about safety, and I know we've talked about it, and I know you've talked about it in the past, but if you are on your own, make sure somebody knows you're out there, right? Good advice, Jay. Yeah. Now we've talked about it. I know you were the one you're the one who's told me that in the past. So we've definitely featured that in previous.
Do I always practice what I preach? Yeah. Good question.
Text me more often, Nigel. I'm not the man to come running up a mountain for you, but I'll phone the right people for you. I can promise you that much. Nigel, I just want to feed you some of this, mate, because it's a fantastic hour that we've spent again tonight. Nigel has given me more inspiration in this last hour just to go out and take photos ad lib. I did too much planning in the past.
Wow! Thank you very much, whoever said that.
That was from Linda. A brilliant webinar, full of information and inspiration. So that one's there. That's from Ted. That was the guy who asked us about the serendipity. So that brilliant.
Thank you, Ted.
Fantastic explanation of ideas I've heard about but not really understood until now. Really want to simplify how I shoot. Great webinar, thank you. That's from John. Another enjoyable and informative hour. Thanks, Nigel. Looking forward to the next one. And thanks again for a great presentation. And I've just got to sort of second all of that, or third all of that.